Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tom McMillan, the CEO of the LEAD1 Association, and I want to welcome you once again to the LEAD1 angle, where we discuss important issues in college sports with key and influential players. And today, we're pleased to have as our guest Dr. Andrew McGregor, who is a professor of history at Dallas College, where one of his specialties is college sports. Dr. McGregor was Kansas raised, went to the University of Nevada, and did his graduate school at Purdue, where he received his doctorate. So recently, I was reading the Washington Post, and lo and behold, there's an article that Andrew wrote about Oklahoma and Texas and their announced move to the SEC. And it really caught my attention. And I reached out to Andrew and I said, would you have a conversation about this? So that's how we ended up being here today. And Andrew, welcome to LEAD1 Angle. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Well, in your story, in your article, you talked about how, and you've spent a lot of time studying Oklahoma and so forth, writing about Bud Wilkinson and the like. And you talked about how Oklahoma University and other schools had waged a century-long fight against the NCAA's central authority in college athletics. You want to expand on that principle?
Yeah, the NCAA's foundation was a discussion body about how to agree on different principles and ideas, and it wasn't until about the mid-1950s that it became a regulatory body. And there was some controversy about that development. There was controversy in the 1929 with the Carnegie Report, and how do we sort of rein in college athletics and sort of regulate scholarships and recruitment and ensure that students are actually students and not just coming in there as ringers to be athletes and not pay attention to the classroom. And so there's a series of back and forth between the athletic conferences and eventually the NCAA emerges as a regulatory body. And along that same time, they emerge as the sort of central negotiating agent of television and media contracts. And so the sort of seizure of that central authority ruffled a lot of schools the wrong way, including Notre Dame and the University of Pennsylvania when it comes to TV, as well as Oklahoma and other schools when it comes to TV. And then early probation in 1950s, Oklahoma was one of the first schools on NCAA probation. And so there's a resentment there, and there's sometimes they felt like the NCAA's authority wasn't actually in the best interest of students or of the school or the state that the school is sort of owned by or serving its constituency wasn't served. And so there was a lot of back and forth between schools, conferences, and even state legislatures about that seizure of authority. And so this struggle has been ongoing since really the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and continues with the 1980s with the Supreme Court decision, Oklahoma versus the NCAA, and where Oklahoma and Georgia sued to sort of break up the TV plan of the NCAA, and that expands money. And so there's this long-standing sort of antagonistic relationship between certain universities, certain conferences, and the NCAA. And I sort of look at Oklahoma and Texas leaving the Big 12 as part of that conflict because of some of the ramifications it could potentially have with the SEC becoming a major power player and with sort of the further deregulation of the NCAA with the NIL and some of that. And so the Supreme Court case this summer sort of points to some ideas that the NCAA might no longer be the only player when it comes to regulating college sports.
Well, I want to talk about the present, but I still want to focus on the history and the past because I think it's interesting how the past tends to repeat itself. But back in the early days, in the 30s and 40s, they had something called home rule, which basically said institutions would police themselves on adherence to constitutional principles. And that kind of went on for a period of time. And there was a lot of controversy to that because it was hard to have an even playing field. Certain schools were offering lavish benefits and the like. And then in 1946, they said, no, we've got to change all that. And they came up with a sanity code. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting about that, I want you to give color to that sanity code was endorsed unanimously by all of the schools. And that, for the first time, the NCAA said, we can set these national rules in particular, the national rules limiting what you can give to a student athlete. You want to expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, so you have the purity code and the sanity code between 46 and 50, and they all agreed on it, but there was no NCAA regulation to what happened if you violated that code. At that point, the NCAA had no power to actually enforce anything, and so you have what's known as the sinful seven, which are these seven schools that they found out were violating it, and the biggest threat would be you just don't schedule them anymore. But nobody really follows through with that, and so that is part of that discussion that leads to the creation of NCAA probation in 1953, because they have to decide who's going to regulate that. Do we actually want somebody to enforce our rules? And so home rule sort of gives way to a national enforcement, and so we emerge as a national. You can play, and so we think about like sectional games playing across the country is important. If you just have a small, like I'm only going to play in the Big Ten or in the SEC, it doesn't matter. And so to think about the present, we can think about home rule almost returning in a sense, and with the NIL, that's exactly what's happening, and with the collaboration or the alliance between the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and the ACC is sort of uh, I don't know, this was after our last conversation, but we can sort of see that as part of that shifting landscape. Is we're trying to figure out it's not going to be a home rule, but we know the NCAA might not have the same central authority, and so this fluctuation is reminiscent of that old time. But it's also okay. The NCAA has central authority, but amateurism has sort of been weakened severely, and so without amateurism, what does the NCAA do?
Yeah. And so it's interesting because you talk about the century long conflict between certain schools and the centralization of authority, and that yet unanimously in 1946 they passed this sanity code to really come up with uniformity and harmonization on what student athletes get. But also interestingly, once they put that enforcement regime in place, Oklahoma was the first one of the first schools
Hmm.
to be put on probation. And so that created even greater animus, which led to the Supreme Court decision in the 80s. You want to chat about that a bit?
Yeah, so I think the animus, it was always there. Again, the sanity code was universally agreed on, but the enforcement wasn't. And so the enforcement comes later, and there were different debates. You know, some conferences wanted scholarships, some didn't. Who should enforce it? There's actually a plan that enforcement of athletic eligibility and all of that would be tied to your accreditation. And there's a plan by like the ACE and other academic organizations that the schools really didn't want happening, and so they sort of conceded to the NCAA power in the mid 50s. And so there was a couple of different plans on how do we rein in college athletics and enforce scholarly standards. Now, the NCAA and Oklahoma's relationship is not just about probation; it's also about TV money. And so, how do you make money? And the TV money idea in the 50s. Well, Oklahoma had a senator, a state senator, who was really anti. He was like anti NCAA. He was like, Oklahoma owns OU. It's a state institution, and what that state institution produces should be the people of Oklahoma's. And so if they were on TV and they were one of the best teams in the 1950s, and this is part of the reason why they were so angry, was they could have made so much more TV money, but they had to be a part of the NCAA TV plan, which meant they were limited to a number of times on TV. And then the bulk of that money, almost 60%, went to the NCAA, and it was skimmed and then reallocated to the members. And so Oklahoma felt like they were being cheated out of what was rightfully their money, which should have gone to their citizens. And so there's
So it's
this
interesting.
interesting,
So,
yeah.
Justice Byron White, Rhodes Scholar,
Hmm.
esteemed football player, Heisman Trophy winner, he wrote the minority dissent in that decision where he said this would lead to the commercialism over really academic values. But I think in the short run, if if Byron White were still alive today, he would say that that decision was probably helpful to unleashing the TV entrepreneurialism that has led to such viewer choices in this country. He might be looking at it today, and he would wonder whether the commercialism has gotten. He might have a different view about it today. But I think in the short run, he might see the benefits of what has happened with deregulation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think deregulation is interesting because in some ways college football was already a commercial entity and it was already big time entertainment. And some people would refer to it as a minor league as early as the 1930s for some professional sports like the NFL, and obviously the NFL wasn't a major sport till the 60s. But I do think the deregulation does a lot for a lot of schools. It increases the amount of money, but it also increases facilities. And so we think about deregulation in tandem with Title IX. It increases money, maybe not in the way it should have. Like we can always critique how it happened, but it provides more money for more opportunity, for better facilities, for better things. And so you see the explosion of the number of facilities and the number of opportunities created in the 80s and in the 90s for schools. Eventually, that'll lead to the arms race when it comes to athletic facilities and coaching salaries, which might not be the best use of money. So we can critique that, but we can also say having better safety equipment, better fields, better locker rooms, better medical staff, better personnel for support for academics and athletics is all something that would be a positive from the deregulation of TV and the increase of money for athletics.
Yeah, that TV entrepreneurism did raise a lot of the boats in
Mhm.
college sports, no question. Let's fast forward now. So now we're heading down towards this modified home rule where conferences and schools will have a lot more autonomy. The NCAA is going to devolve probably a lot of authority in this constitutional convention. Where do
Mhm.
you see this the risk in that? I mean, where do you see the problems in that? Will we come back to a sanity code 10 years from now?
I'm not sure if we'll go back to a sanity code. I think one of the issues we're going to see is we're going to see a further splintering of who can compete and who cannot compete. So you mentioned how deregulation raised the boat. So you have a lot of schools that will go and they'll raise their quality of football and they'll try to compete. Like you think of like the Boise States of the world, or some of these schools that weren't necessarily a major program, but then also become more major because they have the TV eyes and they have the more money to invest in recruiting. And so I think we're going to have a splintering. So Division 1 might get down to 60, 64 schools or something rather than 100 or 105 what it is now. And so I think we're going to have the splintering of who can compete and who can afford not to compete. um, I don't think college will sports will sort of devolve in terms of not having people compete, but I think the level. So like if you're not in the SEC, if you're not in one of those Power Five, which is kind of already the case, but not as it's not as exclusive as it will become, I think, in the next several years. This exclusivity will mean that the rules will change because some schools in the top tier can afford the NIL, they can afford to pay players, they can afford certain things that those smaller schools won't be able to do. And so that will be kind of a splintering. And so even though they're benefiting from the television money, not everybody's going to benefit equally from it.
So let's talk about an issue that could come forward here with this continued evolution of college sports is the employer employee relationship, which we've talked about,
Hmm.
where New York State has put a bill in to classify college athletes as employees. There are federal bills to do that with collective bargaining. Where do you see all that going, particularly where in conferences where there will be a lot of money, like the SEC will, but it's also in an area that is less employer employee friendly. So how do you crystal ball all that?
That's a really fascinating question. I think it's more ominous than or it's less ominous than we think because there's already established relationships for students, like graduate students or employees and students. And so I think there's a model that we can sort of follow existing in the relationship between certain students who are employees and certain ones that aren't. But I think because of the sheer amount of money and the sheer amount of attention on college sports, it's going to look differently. But we can look at like graduate unions, we can look at the right to work state differences. Really depends on where you go. And so the politics of the local politics are really going to influence who can and who can't compete. It'll be interesting to see if there are like SEC schools that are in states that aren't right to work states and how they would respond to a potential unionization, right?
Well,
Because
let's play that out because let's assume that California passes a collective bargaining bill. They have a revenue sharing bill there, so let's assume where New York passes collective bargaining.
yeah,
Like, and all of a sudden, college football players, can make several $100,000 in revenue sharing, and basketball players the same. And literally every other sport, uh, short of Title IX, is going to be cut. But those football and basketball players are going to be doing very well. How will other conferences that don't have revenue sharing compete? And will there have to be a national solution here?
I think there'll probably have to be a national solution. I think in one sense you could see, and I think this may be me being more pessimistic, is those schools with revenue sharing might just not opt to participate in sport because it would be too expensive for them. And so I think what will happen is it's more likely that those schools will sort of decrease or defund or deprofessionalize their sports, and the schools that without revenue sharing will sort of thrive in this old system. And
That's an
so
interesting comment, but Senator Murphy in Connecticut, who's pushing the national collective bargaining bill, he thinks two things happen. One is that I think there's language in the bill that's they're not going to let you cut everything else, so you're going to end up cutting salaries and coaches and so forth, and trying to right size your operations.
Mhm.
But he also thinks that's the solution to a lot of the problems. When the CFP announces they're going to 12 games, the players are going to have a say about it. The players will have a much bigger voice in that arrangement. But is that a threat, or is that just something that you have to keep an eye on, and maybe something happen down the road 5, 10 years from now? Do you think it's fairly? You think it could be immediate?
I don't think it's an immediate threat. No,
Yeah,
I think there's enough sports fans that are also voters on both partisan, like college football isn't necessarily a partisan sport. Like people like to say college football is very conservative, but I've lived in enough places to know that everybody likes college football and everybody wants to defend the status quo for the most part. And so there's a lot of people who are like, I don't want these athletes getting paid. I didn't get paid. And so I think the immediacy isn't there because it's not politically viable for most of the electorate and most of the fan base. But I think long term, there's going to be a real question about the future of college football, both because of health and safety, but also because of the economics of it. And so, I think the collective revenue sharing would definitely cut down on coaching and administrator salaries. I think that's how colleges would try to figure out how to make that work successfully. Um, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. No.
yeah, obviously this new alliance or quasi alliance of some of the Power Five schools, the ACC and the Pac-12, the Big Ten, kind of making a focus on academic issues. I mean, as we head towards this model of athletes making more and more money, I mean, some of these NIL athletes will make $1 million. As athletes making more and more money, and they're in the drive towards creating employment and collective bargaining, what does that do to the academic mission in your view? In other words, how does a kid who's making money from NIL, also if he's possibly making money as an employee, how in the world do academics stack up to that?
They don't, and I think that's the decentering of academics from athletics, or the decoupling of them when it comes to this. And so when we start talking about revenue, they're thinking about this is their career, and if they can make a significant amount of money in those 4 or 5 years, then and if they're wise about it, then they won't necessarily have to be college educated. They can figure out ways to do something else, particularly if there's a second career, a professional career after that. But for a lot of athletes, this is going to be their career. Um, I think the relationship with academics is already strained, and it's been strained for
Mhm.
several decades. So I think that's going to be where we see a lot of pushback from faculty. But I think some of that pushback will be, hey, let's give them education, but let's decouple it from their playing time. So you might say, hey, you can play for 4 or 5 years and then you can come back and get your degree once you're done, because we know that already we've had students say this, we've had other people say this, that the priority of education isn't there right now. The ability to be a good student when you're limited by practice time, when you're limited by injury, when you're limited by traveling to games, limits what you can take. I've had friends that were athletes who they weren't told this explicitly, but they were sort of steered towards certain studies programs because of the flexibility of that coursework. And so I think if we decouple that, in some ways, that's actually a good thing, because then athletes can make their money, they can compete without infringing upon their education, which is really the most important thing, at least from a faculty member, which I am, point of view.
Interesting. It's like Bill Gates dropping out of Harvard to go
Right.
work on a computer, Microsoft. So it's a interesting concept. You're a historian. You study
Yeah.
history, so you can predict the future. What does your study of history in college sports portend for the future of college sports?
Ooh, I don't know if I can predict the future. I'm not that good,
Well,
but
what lessons do you think can be drawn from
I
history?
think the lessons that we can draw is that this isn't new. There's always been this confrontation. There's always been these reform efforts in the history of college football, in the history of the NCAA. Reform hasn't happened fast. Reform has been very slow, and reform efforts haven't been unanimous. I mean, kind of, but not really unanimous. And so, the more we see about money, the more we see about media, the more we see money rise, the more we think about control and reform. But then now we've gotten to that deregulation. And so when we get to deregulation, we see again money and salary, and education keeps slipping further and further behind. And so I think the future of college sports is that sort of employee relationship. It's that relationship of you get money, education is important, but it's not the reason why you're here anymore. And I think that's
So
really,
it really devolves more into an entertainment
yeah,
asset than an educational asset.
that's
So
what I think the future is, and I think we're already halfway there, honestly. And I think because the entertainment aspect's so important, universities are they're going to continue sponsoring teams, but they're going to do so as a sort of a marketing thing. And there's been studies that have done to say if your team is this successful, your enrollment or your freshman applications will increase. And so there's a usefulness here, and a lot of people say the best product of their state college is their athletic teams. And so we see the value in there as fans, as taxpayers, as et cetera. But I think if that becomes the case, and it kind of already is, then because of the revenue streams, the potential and the opening of the door of the end of amateurism means that we're going to have to rethink what is the relationship between athletics and academics. And that relationship is really challenging already. So for me, my proposal would be let them play and then give them the education as part of their compensation, but let them choose when they want that education.
mhm. The role of Congress in college sports has been very limited. Of course, you have the federal government in Title IX in 1972. I think the next bill was the bill that I sponsored with Bill Bradley and Ed Towns, where we forced the disclosure of graduation rates. And
Hmm.
then later, a few years later, there was a bill disclosing financial information. But other than Title IX disclosure bills, there hasn't been much passed in Congress about college sports. Do you think any of this will rise to the level where Congress feels that really they need to get involved? I mean, look at NIL. NIL kind of sort of petered out. They want a national bill, but I mean, it seems to lost some steam in the last few weeks.
Yeah, I don't see it when it comes to the economics. I mean, the AAU would be the next kind of example. The AAU bill, I think it was 1973.
Well, that
Um,
was the Olympic. That was the Olympic,
right.
and
But
but
like
that
thinking
was
about
sort of.
I
Mhm.
have amateurism. So we consistently think of college sports and amateur sports as sort of two fingers on the same hand, right? Even though they're not synonymous. And so they've gotten involved in some of those things, but I don't see that being an issue. I think if anything gets involved, Congress will get involved. It will be sort of the violence and the sexual assault kind of things that have happened that have come out
Mhm.
repeatedly over the last 10 years. I think Congress might get involved with that, but I don't know if they're actually going to get involved with the money stuff. I mean, the main thing they would want to do is just be able to tax it, right?
Mhm.
And so if they can figure out how to create a special exemption, maybe that would get lobbied by universities. Like, hey, can you not tax certain things so we can afford to have college sports? That's the only way I could see them getting involved. I don't think I don't think there's the will, the political will, both by the everyday person and by congressmen to actually uh, get their hands dirty, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not going to make very many friends passing things.
Well, I mean, football and basketball are totally different than all the other sports. So, what may you do for football and basketball? They may be employees. Does that mean the hockey player, the softball player are employees? And how do you tax football and basketball and not tax hockey and softball? In other words, if you have this situation where you have two sports that are real businesses and all the others that aren't, how do you reconcile that from a regulatory and tax standpoint? I mean, these are questions that ought to be
Yeah.
grappled.
Yeah, these are questions I can't answer. These are the reasons why I don't think there would be a bill, because then you would have to completely separate college football and basketball. And while we do so intellectually, we don't necessarily in practice. At least the NCAA hasn't too much. And I think that's part of the reason why the NCAA has lost some of its relevance. It's because they're treating everything as the same, even though they're not the same. Um, and I also think baseball and hockey depends where you're at. Some places those are on par with football and basketball, and
Yeah.
so because there's such variation across sports, across colleges, across different levels of Division 1 versus Division 2 and Division 3, it's going to be really hard to have a one size fits all policy. And that's why I'm so hesitant to say that such thing will exist.
Well, the other side of this is that, we've seen now this modified home rule, probably going to, something like that's going to occur. And there will be inequities, and there'll be some excesses, and there'll be some abuses, and there'll be some screaming and yelling. But the next call for central authority will not come from the NCAA because they've been sort of neutered by lawsuits. If there is going to be re-centralization, it would have to come from Congress. In other words, if this version of home rule fails, and there's enough people that are upset about it, like the Sanity Code in the 40s, the only recourse would be Congress. Would you agree with that point?
I would definitely agree with that point. And I guess my point, the reason why I'm still hesitant is because one of the things that Justice Kavanaugh wrote in his dissension this summer with the NAIL lawsuit or the case was that competition is important, and he really sort of reemphasized the free market notion when it comes to regulating college sports. And so, how do you have sort of this free market idea when it comes to the regulation of college sports and who can benefit from their athletic labor in various ways? And so, the only way to sort of limit that free market would be governmental. But our politics don't really. We're not in a regulation sort of era. You know, regulation was a 70s sort of thing. A 60s, 70s, we're going to do regulation. But now that we're in such a deregulation free market era, I don't see the political will for that. And hopefully that changes because I think we do need a central authority. I'm not like celebrating the death of the NCAA at all. I think we need somebody to step in and make sure we have level playing fields. I don't know that there's the will for that quite yet. And I think as this plays out, that will might develop pretty quickly. But it'll kind of depend how it looks.
Well, clearly, I think you would agree that if problems occur with this modified home rule that we're heading towards, that it could be the catalyst to get Congress involved
Mhm.
because, for whatever reason, you mentioned consumers may feel that they're getting a bad deal because their team can never get out of the bottom of the standings or whatever reasons. You suggested some things that consumers may drive this as well.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, I
but
think consumers are going to drive it more than the athletes because we're in an era of politics where the consumer has more power often than the laborer does.
mhm.
And so most scholars, most activists focus on college sports as a labor issue, and they focus on athlete treatment and athlete rights, and I support that, and I feel very strongly about those things. But I think when we talk about a real strong sort of grassroots effort to get something changed, I think it's going to become for the consumers because they're the ones who are, in a sense, paying for these things.
So if you had to forecast 10, 15 years from now, you think basketball and football players will be have full employment rights, potentially collective bargaining. They'll make salaries. They'll make a lot of money with NIL. Some athletes could be making millions of dollars in college football and basketball. In a lot of schools, not all, could look very much like the modified forms of the NFL and NBA. Is that a fair picture, or is that one that's a little too radical?
I think that's a little too radical. I don't think it's going to happen that fast. And I think more likely than that happening, we'll see schools abandon the sport because of health and because of concussions and things like that. And
Hmm.
so that's another thing that's sort of hanging in the balance is we have the future of can we even afford to do all this? Yes, kind of, but like so there's the doom and gloom of the economic situation as well as the doom and gloom of sort of the health and safety situation. And so I think 10 or 15 years college football might not even look like it does now. We might see a change in rules to make it safer. And so I'm hesitant to say that the sport's going to exist as it does now in 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, your perspective is so valuable, and I love to ask you the devil's advocate question. But as our time is wrapping up, so you're an original Kansas-born student athlete, and you were a fan of Jim Ryan.
Yeah.
Well, I had the pleasure. I used to run with Jim Ryan in the House gym, the House Representative gym. We'd go down there and we'd run on the treadmill. Now I could never keep up with him, but pretty special athlete.
Yeah, Ryan. So I ran track and cross country in high school and college, and Ryan
Yeah.
was one of the people I looked up to. You know, he's a Kansan. He ran under 4 minutes, and he was a congressman when I was growing up. And so I was always interested in how he was able to blend and use his career to become something more than an athlete, which is
Yeah.
something I've tried to do as well.
Well, I see him from time to time, so I'll tell him that he has a fan, and certainly appreciate your taking the time to be with us on the Lead One Angle. And your views are very insightful because I think you really understand the history of college sports. And listen, we thank you for joining us today, Andy.
I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you.